The Forgotten Children of Conquerors. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. So, if you're already tucked in, lights low, and the blanket just right perfect, because this evening's story isn't about heroes or villains. It's about the children left behind by both, the sons and daughters of conquerors, and of the conquered, who existed in the strange, gray space after empires fell. They were hostages, bargaining chips, and sometimes surprises that complicated the neat lines of royal succession. Most of them were forgotten. But, as with so many things in history, forgetting doesn't mean they didn't leave fingerprints on what came next. So, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's drift back. The battle smoke has cleared, the banners have been torn down, and standing among the rubble are the children who now belong to someone else's empire. We'll start, as many strange royal tales do, in medieval Europe, where conquest was both a profession and a family hobby. When kings and emperors went to war, they rarely thought about the children that war would produce or capture, and yet their offspring became the quiet threads holding together treaties, dynasties, and fragile truces. Take, for example, the children of the Plantagenets, that famously temperamental English dynasty who spent centuries shouting at France and occasionally at themselves. When King John of England, the villain of every Robin Hood story, lost Normandy to the French King Philip II, the cost wasn't only in castles. His daughter, Eleanor, was captured by the French. She was 13 years old and suddenly became a royal souvenir. The French king, being a practical man, decided she would make a good bargaining piece. He locked her up for 16 years, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was useful. Eleanor of England spent most of her youth as a prisoner, not in chains, but in a series of pleasant enough castles where she could be displayed when needed. She was eventually married off to a French cousin, a reminder that in medieval diplomacy, family was less about affection and more about strategy. And perhaps the saddest part is that Eleanor barely entered the record after that. She was born a princess, became a pawn, and disappeared into the French nobility with the quiet efficiency of a political eraser. This pattern wasn't unusual. Conquerors didn't just take land, they took heirs. It was one of the more convenient traditions of medieval Europe. If you couldn't trust an enemy's word, you could at least keep their children as collateral. A few centuries earlier, in the time of Charlemagne, this practice had already become standard. When the great emperor subjugated the Lombards in Italy, he made sure to secure the loyalty of their royal family in the most obvious way, by marrying their daughter. Her name was Desiderata, and she was young, beautiful, and, unfortunately, completely unwanted. Charlemagne married her for politics, then promptly decided he didn't like Italians and sent her back. Her father lost his throne soon after, and Desiderata, like many daughters of fallen kings, vanished from history's polite conversation. The pattern repeats so often that it almost becomes soothing in its predictability. Empire rises, someone loses, their children are shipped off as insurance, spouses, or polite hostages. They learn new languages, new loyalties, and, occasionally, how to pretend they aren't constantly being watched. Let's drift eastward to Byzantium, the empire that refused to die quietly. Byzantine politics made Western Europe look like amateur hour. When the Byzantines captured royal children, they didn't just imprison them, they redecorated them. Hostages were brought into the imperial court, dressed in gold-threaded robes, educated, and baptized in the proper Orthodox way. It was both a show of generosity and a reminder, you're part of our world now. Try not to forget who owns the throne. One famous example was the story of Boris and Gleb, the sons of the Bulgarian king. Their father had fought the Byzantines, lost, and promptly had his boys sent to Constantinople for safekeeping, of course. There, they were treated like princes, trained like courtiers, and quietly reprogrammed to admire Greek architecture. When they eventually returned to Bulgaria, they were loyal but not to their homeland. They ruled as Byzantine puppets, living proof that cultural conquest was often more enduring than military victory. The Ottomans, centuries later, perfected this model. When they conquered a territory, they often demanded hostages, though the polite term was tribute children. These were the sons of local rulers, sent to the Sultan's court to be raised as Ottomans. It sounds terrible, and it often was, but it was also strangely effective. Many of these boys rose through the Ottoman ranks, becoming generals, administrators, even viziers. They were loyal, capable, and thoroughly detached from their birth nations. One of the most famous examples was Skanderbeg, the Albanian prince. He was sent to the Ottoman court as a child, trained in warfare, and converted to Islam. The empire gave him a new name, Iskender Bey, and for years, he served the Sultan faithfully, until one day, he didn't. Skanderbeg defected, reclaimed his homeland, and became a national hero in Albania. It's tempting to imagine him sitting in his tent at night, staring into the fire, wondering which empire he actually belonged to. Raised by one, fighting for another, and never fully trusted by either. That was the quiet tragedy of being a conqueror's child. You belonged everywhere and nowhere. Let's drift north to the icy courts of Scandinavia, where even kings tended to behave like professional wrestlers. During the Viking Age, hostages were a kind of social currency. You could raid someone's coast, steal a few of their relatives, and then politely ransom them back over dinner. Children of rival chiefs were swapped like diplomatic pets. They were raised in foreign halls, trained to fight, and often became more loyal to their captors than to their parents. A young Norwegian noble might grow up among Danes, learn their ways, and return home thoroughly confused about which side he was meant to raid next. It wasn't all bad. Some of these arrangements created lifelong friendships, or at least tolerable in-laws. But the emotional whiplash must have been extraordinary. Imagine growing up with the people who conquered your father, then being expected to fight them later. The sagas never quite captured that quiet, human strangeness. They talk about vengeance, honor, and blood feuds, not about the children sitting in foreign longhouses, trying to remember which god they were supposed to pray to. The Middle Ages weren't alone in this habit. The Romans had done it first, as they tended to do with most things. When Rome expanded across Europe, it routinely took the sons of tribal leaders hostage. Officially, this was to educate them in Roman ways. Unofficially, it meant, try anything rebellious, and we'll see how long your son keeps breathing. One of the most famous examples was the story of Arminius, the Germanic prince who would one day destroy 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. As a boy, Arminius was sent to Rome as a hostage. He learned Latin, wore togas, and served in the Roman army. They trusted him completely, which, naturally, was their mistake. When he returned to Germania, he organized one of the greatest ambushes in ancient history, annihilating Rome's finest. The empire never fully recovered from the humiliation. It's hard not to imagine Arminius, years earlier, sitting in some marble hall in Rome, repeating Latin grammar drills, quietly filing away every Roman tactic he was taught. Sometimes, conquerors trained their own undoing. Let's drift forward again to the late medieval and early modern world, where royal children became the diplomatic equivalent of bubble wrap, used once and forgotten. After the Hundred Years' War, France and England spent several generations trying to marry each other into peace. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Royal daughters were traded like gifts. Margaret of Anjou, Catherine of Valois, Mary Tudor, each promised that this time, this marriage would fix everything. It never did. Catherine of Valois, for example, married Henry V of England, the conquering hero of Agincourt. She was beautiful, French, and deeply unlucky. Her husband died suddenly, leaving her a widowed queen at 21, with a newborn son, the future Henry VI. England saw her as both valuable and dangerous. If she remarried, her new husband could claim power through her. So Parliament passed a law forbidding her to marry without permission, which, naturally, she ignored. Catherine secretly married a Welshman named Owen Tudor, a minor courtier with good hair and very bad timing. Their children would eventually start the Tudor dynasty, proof that sometimes the forgotten offspring of forbidden love could end up ruling an empire. But not all such stories end in triumph. Most don't. Consider the daughters of defeated kings in the Renaissance period, paraded through enemy courts, dressed beautifully, and quietly pitied. They were reminders of other people's victories. One such girl was Joanna of Castile, later nicknamed Joanna the Mad. Her story is often told as one of insanity, but beneath the royal gossip, there's something quieter. A woman crushed by the machinery of empire. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, those Ferdinand and Isabella of Columbus fame. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. He was, unfortunately, both handsome and profoundly unpleasant. When her mother died, Joanna inherited Castile. When her husband died, she inherited a coffin she refused to let out of sight. They called her mad, but really, she was just a woman surrounded by people who wanted her throne. Her children included Emperor Charles V, ruler of half the known world, who promptly locked her away for life. It's hard not to feel that the empire her parents built was paid for, in part, by her misery. The child of conquerors, conquered in turn by her own bloodline. And then there were the illegitimate ones, the hidden children of kings and soldiers who were never meant to exist, but did anyway. They were perhaps the truest forgotten children of conquest, born in the aftermath of war, in burned villages and temporary camps, to mothers who had no choice and fathers who had no intention of remembering. These children rarely made it into Chronicles, but they existed everywhere, the quiet genetic residue of empire. Sometimes they rose to prominence. More often, they blended back into the population, carrying royal blood that would never be recognized. One of Napoleon's mistresses, for example, gave birth to a son who was quietly adopted by another family. He grew up to become a scholar, unaware that his father had once tried to conquer Europe, which is probably for the best. History is full of these shadows, people who bridged the gap between conqueror and conquered, who carried both victory and defeat in their veins. They were the children who spoke two languages, prayed to two gods, and never quite belonged to either. When you trace royal family trees far enough, you begin to realize that nearly every crown was held in place by a web of forgotten faces, the hostages who survived, the illegitimate heirs who stayed quiet, the daughters married off and erased from the record. They were the silent glue of history, invisible, but holding everything together. Let's pause here for a breath. If you're still awake, don't worry, we're just getting started. In the next part, we'll drift further into these dynastic tangles. We'll meet the royal children who were bred more for politics than survival, and who paid the price for other people's ambitions. So, for now, rest your mind. The battles are over, the palaces are quiet, and somewhere, in the flickering candlelight of a long-forgotten hall, a royal child dreams of a home that no longer exists. Sickly, spoiled, and sad, the royal children who weren't built to rule. Hey, everyone, if you're still awake, welcome back. If you drifted off halfway through part 1, that's fine too. We're in no rush here. Tonight, we're staying in the nursery, though not the cheerful kind with toys and lullabies. This one smells faintly of damp velvet and political anxiety, because the children of kings were rarely children at all. They were miniature dynasties, little bundles of expectation wrapped in brocade, and from the moment they were born, their health, behavior, and hairline were everyone's business. Some were overindulged to the point of absurdity. Others were ignored entirely, but almost all of them were, in one way or another, unfit for the thrones waiting for them. Let's start with one of the more famous cases of royal fragility, Charles II of Spain. Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty so inbred that their family tree looked more like a wreath. He was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV and his niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece. It's never a good sign when your family's wedding guest list overlaps with its family reunion. From the beginning, Charles was not what one would call thriving. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his jaw was so deformed by generations of cousin marriage that chewing food was more of a suggestion than a function. His courtiers, who were very polite, called him El Hequizado, the bewitched, partly because of superstition, but mostly because genetically compromised didn't sound poetic enough. Charles's reign was a long, slow-motion collapse. He was kind, apparently, and painfully pious. He also had the constitution of a Victorian ghost. Spain under him became a decaying empire ruled by priests, cousins, and opportunists, often all the same people. By the time he died, childless and exhausted at 38, Spain was ready to be conquered by whoever could pronounce their own name without slurring from jaw deformity. It's easy to pity him, this fragile king surrounded by relics and schemers, but in a strange way, Charles too represented the entire royal problem, the assumption that blood alone could rule an empire, even when that blood had been circulating in the same family for 200 years. Let's drift north to Austria, because where there's a Habsburg, there's usually trouble. A generation after Charles came Maria Theresa's children. She was the Empress of Austria, the last of her line, and a proud mother of 16. That's not a typo. 16. Imagine being the 17th century version of a royal toddler with 16 siblings, all named something vaguely saintly and Austrian. Among them was Marie Antoinette, who would one day be shipped off to France and to history's least successful public relations campaign. But before the guillotine, there was the childhood. Marie grew up in the most elaborately sheltered environment imaginable. Her nurses powdered her wigs. Her tutors gave up on Latin within a week, and she spent most of her youth being admired for doing very little very prettily. When she was 14, she was married off to Louis XVI of France, a boy her own age, equally sheltered and equally confused by the idea of being a spouse. Together, they became Europe's most awkward power couple. Louis spent his free time collecting locks and playing with keys. Literally, keys. Marie Antoinette spent hers trying to build a fake peasant village where she could pretend to be humble, but still have fresh pastries delivered from the palace kitchen. Their tragedy wasn't just in their deaths, though those were dramatic enough. It was in their complete inability to understand the world outside their rooms. They were children of luxury, taught everything except how to survive without it. Now, let's drift further back to England, where royal childhoods were less about comfort and more about survival. Take Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, the long-awaited male heir, born after his father had divorced, executed, or exiled half the female population of England. Edward was a clever child, serious, devout, and probably doomed from the moment he inhaled his first whiff of Tudor ambition. Henry VIII adored him in theory, but rarely saw him in person. Edward grew up in the care of tutors and physicians, kept away from other children to ensure he wouldn't catch anything contagious, which, in Tudor England, was practically everything. He ascended the throne at 9 years old. At that age, most children are still losing their milk teeth. Edward was losing his childhood. He ruled for 6 years, or rather, a series of ambitious adults ruled through him. Before dying of tuberculosis at 15, his half-sister Mary became queen after him. Her reign ended with mass burnings, another half-sibling rebellion, and a nickname she'd probably hate, Bloody Mary. It's tempting to see the Tudor siblings, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, as the royal equivalent of a dysfunctional group project. Same father, different mothers, incompatible goals. Each one left their mark, but none of them had what you'd call a healthy upbringing. Speaking of Elizabeth, let's linger there a moment. Elizabeth I, the great Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, is remembered as one of England's most formidable rulers. But as a child, she was a walking political liability. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when Elizabeth was 2.5. Her father alternated between neglect and paranoia. She was declared illegitimate, reinstated, nearly executed, and constantly reminded that her existence was conditional. It's no wonder she never married. Her childhood taught her that intimacy came with a death warrant. Still, Elizabeth managed to survive where others didn't, partly through intelligence, partly through luck, and partly because she understood that in a world run by dangerous men, self-control was the ultimate weapon. She turned caution into policy, repression into theater, and solitude into strength. Her childhood loneliness became an empire. Let's drift eastward again, to Russia, where royal childhoods had a distinctive flavor of frostbite and suspicion. The Romanovs were obsessed with producing heirs, but equally gifted at making them miserable. Consider Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. He wasn't born terrible. He was made that way. As a child, he watched boyars, Russian nobles, murder his family members and steal from his treasury. They treated the young prince like a puppet, mocking him, starving him, and occasionally beating him for sport. When he finally gained real power, he retaliated with a level of violence that can only be described as thorough. By adulthood, Ivan trusted no one and executed freely, including, notoriously, his own son. It's difficult to pinpoint where the trauma ended and the tyranny began, but if you start your life being terrorized by adults, it's not entirely surprising when you grow up to terrorize everyone else. The same pattern appears, in a softer but still tragic form, in Tsarevich Alexei, the last heir of the Russian Empire. Born in 1904 to Nicholas II and Alexandra, Alexei had everything, except the one thing no empire could give him: working blood. He suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disease that turned minor injuries into medical emergencies. His parents, desperate to protect him, turned to faith healers and mystics, which is how Grigory Rasputin entered the royal nursery. Rasputin claimed he could ease the boy's suffering, and whether by chance, hypnosis, or sheer luck, sometimes he did. The Tsarina saw him as a holy savior. The court saw him as a filthy opportunist. Alexei, poor child, just wanted to play without bleeding to death. His illness made him the center of a web of superstition and secrecy that ultimately helped bring down the Romanovs. By the time the revolution came, his entire family would be executed, the dynasty collapsing under the weight of both disease and delusion. If ever there was a royal child unfit for the brutal machinery of empire, it was Alexei, gentle, frail, and tragically normal in a world that required gods. Not every sickly royal died young. Some survived, only to become precisely the kind of ruler no one wanted. Consider George III of Britain. Yes, the one from Hamilton. He's remembered as the mad king who lost America. But in his youth he was considered almost boringly well-behaved, polite, dutiful, a bit earnest, the sort of young man who might correct your grammar at dinner and apologize afterward. His later mental illness, likely caused by porphyria, turned him into a tragic figure. He would speak to trees, forget his own children, and have moments of startling lucidity where he realized, with horror, that his mind was slipping away. His son, the future George IV, handled the crisis with typical royal sensitivity by hosting banquets and pretending his father didn't exist. The British public, meanwhile, printed satirical pamphlets showing the king in straitjackets, because compassion was still several centuries away. Yet, despite his decline, George III was one of Britain's longest reigning monarchs, proof that endurance sometimes substitutes for greatness. Then there were the spoiled ones, not sick, just terminally indulged. France, again, offers some prime examples. Let's visit Louis XV, who ascended the throne as a small, shy boy and grew into a man best described as chronically distracted by luxury. After a childhood of constant flattery, he became addicted to being adored. He built palaces for mistresses, gardens for gossip, and temples for pleasure. His courtiers called him Louis the Well-Beloved, which was optimistic. By the end of his reign, France was bankrupt. The peasants were starving, and no one liked him anymore. His grandson, Louis XVI, would inherit both the throne and the problem, though, as we know, he'd lose his head over it. The Bourbon line was a perfect example of what happens when royal childhoods are too soft. You get adults who think bread shortages can be solved with more ribbons. Let's drift for a moment to Prussia, land of military precision and emotional repression. Frederick the Great grew up under the rule of his father, Frederick William I, a man who loved discipline, hated art, and once beat his son in public for owning a flute. Frederick tried to run away as a teenager. He was caught. His father executed his closest friend in front of him as a lesson in obedience. Years later, Frederick became one of the greatest generals in Europe, cold, brilliant, and incapable of genuine affection. He wrote beautiful music, but never married. He conquered half of Central Europe, but left no heirs. All of that quiet cruelty, distilled into strategy and solitude. It's tempting to think of these sickly and spoiled royals as mere curiosities, footnotes to the rise and fall of empires. But really, They were the human cost of monarchy. For every golden crown, there was a childhood of isolation. For every grand portrait, a lifetime of fear, of illness, of betrayal, of being the wrong kind of heir. They were raised to be divine, but they remained painfully mortal. They coughed, bled, worried, and aged, just like everyone else. They simply did it in nicer rooms. So, if you're still awake, picture the royal nurseries of history, silent rooms filled with soft light and heavy expectation, tiny beds draped in silk, physicians murmuring, parents whispering prayers not to God, but to the family line. And in the middle, a small child, pale, blinking, unsure why the world already expects so much of them. Because in the end, royal blood was never magical. It was just blood, sometimes too thin, sometimes too tangled, but always human. Let's rest here for a moment. The candles are low, the court physicians are dozing in their chairs, and the empire, for once, is quiet. Next time, we'll drift into something even stranger. The world of royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. A romantic journey through cousin weddings, diplomatic disasters, and the occasional spontaneous nosebleed. But for now, just breathe. You've survived another century of royal absurdity, and that's enough for one night. Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're just tuning in, feel free to get comfortable. This isn't a story that rushes anywhere. Tonight, we're lingering on one of history's strangest traditions, marrying your relatives for political convenience, and then wondering why your family looks increasingly symmetrical. Royal marriages were supposed to build empires, not break chromosomes. But over the centuries, Europe's monarchies developed a charming habit of solving every problem, diplomatic, financial, or existential, by marrying the nearest available cousin. It worked fine for a while, then it didn't. So, let's drift into the candlelit halls of dynastic ambition, where the wine flowed, the cousins mingled, and the gene pool got shallower with every toast. We'll begin, naturally, with the Habsburgs, because if there were Olympic medals for inbreeding, they'd have retired the sport. The Habsburg dynasty ruled much of Europe for nearly 500 years. They had a motto: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry, which sounds poetic until you remember the fine print. The marriages were almost always between first cousins, uncles and nieces, or, occasionally, double cousins. By the 1600s, their family tree resembled a tangle of spaghetti drawn by someone slightly concussed. The most famous genetic casualty of all this was Charles II of Spain. Yes, the same tragic figure we met earlier. His ancestors had been so committed to intra-family bonding that his parents were uncle and niece, and their grandparents were also related. Scientists analyzing his genealogy later calculated that Charles II's genetic inbreeding coefficient was equivalent to that of a child born to parents who were brother and sister. It explains a lot. He had a lower jaw that wouldn't close, a tongue too large for speech, chronic illness, and infertility that sealed the dynasty's doom. When Charles died in 1700, Spain faced a succession crisis so messy it triggered a continent-wide war. It took 2 centuries of cousin weddings to get there, and one bewildered king to end it all. Let's drift gently north to the British Isles, where the royal family took a slightly subtler approach to genetic recycling. By the 19th century, Queen Victoria had become the ultimate genealogical influencer. She had 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and a firm belief that monarchy was a family business. Through careful matchmaking, she managed to marry off her offspring into nearly every royal house in Europe. Her descendants would sit on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, and Spain, often intermarrying with one another again, just to keep things tidy. The result was a sort of pan-European family reunion that doubled as international diplomacy. It worked surprisingly well until the First World War, when all these cousins suddenly found themselves at war with each other. On one side, King George V of Britain; on the other, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany; and in the east, their cousin Nicholas II of Russia, the Tsar. 3 men, 3 empires, one shared grandmother. Victoria might have been proud, if not for the minor inconvenience of millions of people dying in the process. But Queen Victoria's genetic legacy had a darker twist: hemophilia. She carried the gene for this blood-clotting disorder, and it quietly spread through her descendants like a tragic royal signature. Her son Leopold suffered from it directly, but it was her grandsons and great-grandsons who paid the real price. The disease passed through her daughters into the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. In Russia, it struck Tsarevich Alexei, the fragile heir we spoke about before. His illness led to the family's dependence on Rasputin, which in turn fed public outrage, which helped ignite the revolution. So, in a way, the fall of the Romanovs began not with Marx or Lenin, but with a defective gene from a British queen. History can be remarkably literal sometimes. Of course, not all disastrous royal marriages were about biology. Some simply went wrong in the human sense: mismatched personalities, impossible expectations, and the occasional violent misunderstanding. Let's drift back to the Middle Ages, where the idea of marital happiness ranked somewhere below having a functioning sewer. Consider Isabella of France, known to later historians as the She-Wolf of France. She was married to Edward II of England, a king whose hobbies included neglecting his wife, favoring his male courtiers a little too openly, and losing wars he probably shouldn't have started. Edward adored a man named Piers Gaveston, a flashy noble who spent most of his time insulting the rest of the court. Isabella, a clever and politically aware woman, found herself sidelined while her husband and Gaveston played what can only be described as medieval housemates. Eventually, the nobles got tired of the drama and executed Gaveston. Edward never recovered emotionally. Isabella, meanwhile, teamed up with her lover, invaded England, and overthrew her husband. He was later imprisoned and murdered under mysterious and alarmingly unpleasant circumstances. It's not exactly a story you'd put on a wedding invitation. Royal unions were never about love, of course. They were about property, and occasionally, about revenge. Take Henry VIII, who treated matrimony like a form of performance art. He married 6 times, divorced 2, executed 2, and died convinced that God still owed him a son. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was originally married to his brother Arthur. When Arthur died young, Henry inherited both the throne and the widow, because recycling spouses was apparently acceptable royal policy. That marriage failed to produce a surviving son, so Henry decided to remarry. The problem was, the Pope refused to annul it, so Henry simply changed religions, declared himself head of the English Church, and set off a century of religious turmoil, all because of a midlife crisis with theological consequences. His next wife, Anne Boleyn, gave him Elizabeth, but no male heir. For this, she was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. which historians generally agree were invented after her King Jane Seymour, who finally produced the longed-for son, Edward, but died almost immediately after childbirth. Henry mourned her sincerely, at least until his next three wives came and went. By the time he reached his sixth marriage, his waistline and his patience were both running low. In the end, Henry achieved his goal: a son, a lasting dynasty, and a completely restructured national religion. All it cost was several lives, the stability of his country, and his own ability to walk without assistance. Let's drift south again, to France, the royal court that turned self-indulgence into a competitive sport. One of the more unfortunate pairings was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. We met them before, awkwardly polite and catastrophically out of touch. Their marriage was meant to unite Austria and France after generations of hostility. Instead, it united two teenagers who barely understood what marriage entailed. For the first 7 years, the union went unconsummated, a diplomatic crisis disguised as a bedroom issue. Letters between their families read like increasingly exasperated therapy notes. When the problem was finally resolved, it was too late. The public already despised them, she for her extravagance, he for his indecision. The marriage that was supposed to heal Europe instead became the spark that burned down the monarchy. There's probably a moral in there somewhere about communication, or perhaps about not marrying 14-year-olds for strategic reasons. If we drift east, we find the Austro-Hungarian court of the 19th century, a dynasty so rigid it could have been made of marble. Emperor Franz Joseph married his cousin, Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sisi. She was beautiful, restless, and allergic to protocol. He was diligent, disciplined, and allergic to fun. Their marriage began with cautious optimism and ended in decades of mutual misery. Sisi spent much of her life traveling to escape court life, writing melancholy poetry about freedom while being chased by attendants carrying her exercise equipment. Her husband remained in Vienna, managing an empire that was quietly falling apart. In the end, she was assassinated by an anarchist with a sharpened file. One of those small, random tragedies that feel almost inevitable after a lifetime of repression. Their son, Crown Prince Rudolph, didn't fare better. He died in a murder-suicide pact with his lover, leaving no heir, and a scandal so large it practically announced the end of the Habsburg line. A family that had once conquered half of Europe was now dissolving in boredom, depression, and bad romantic decisions. Of course, cousin marriage wasn't limited to Europe. In ancient Egypt, the Ptolemies took it to almost mythic extremes. Determined to preserve their divine bloodline, they married brothers to sisters, generation after generation. It was an impressive act of devotion to both family and delusion. She eventually abandoned that strategy and took up with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, which at least expanded the gene pool slightly, even if it ended badly for everyone involved. When her children inherited the combined DNA of Macedonian Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans, it was less a family tree and more a continental merger. Still, Cleopatra remains proof that inbreeding may have been disastrous for most dynasties, but charisma can cover a multitude of recessive traits. By the 19th century, even as science began explaining why marrying cousins wasn't ideal, European royals were reluctant to stop. Tradition dies hard, and sometimes it limps. When Albert of Saxe-Coburg proposed to Queen Victoria, they were first cousins. No one found this odd. It was practically romantic. Their children would continue the pattern, marrying within the same narrow circle until Europe's royal bloodline resembled an exclusive club with chronic anemia. Even today, Many reigning monarchs across Europe can trace their ancestry back to the same handful of people from the 18th century. It's a small world, smaller than it probably should be. Royal marriages that went wrong genetically were rarely tragedies in isolation. They were slow accumulations of bad choices made over centuries. Part pride, part superstition, part sheer bureaucratic inertia. Every dynasty believed it was preserving purity. In truth, they were simply concentrating flaws, physical, mental, and political, until the entire structure buckled under its own fragility. And yet, there's something quietly human about it all. These were people trapped by their own myths, doing what tradition demanded, even when it no longer made sense. Marrying for love was considered dangerous. Marrying your cousin was considered sensible. History is rarely logical. So, as the candlelight flickers low, imagine a royal wedding hall somewhere in Europe. Gold leaf, incense, jewels, and behind it all, a shared family resemblance that's starting to look a little too consistent. A choir sings, vows are exchanged. Somewhere, a court physician sighs quietly, already foreseeing his future workload, and the guests whisper to one another, such a perfect match. They have the same nose. Indeed, they do. If you're still awake, you've now survived several centuries of cousinly devotion and dynastic decline. In our next gentle descent into history, we'll visit the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens, a guided meditation on grudges, gossip, and royal temper tantrums. But for now, let's close the palace doors. The musicians are packing up, the candles are melting into silence, and the family tree is sighing under its own weight. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your family reunions be less complicated. The pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake after 3 centuries of inbred royal romance, congratulations, you've earned this next one. Tonight, we're staying in the royal courts of Europe, but turning our attention from genetics to personality, because even when the bloodlines weren't defective, the tempers usually were. You might think running a kingdom would leave little time for petty feuds and emotional meltdowns. You'd be wrong. Power, it turns out, does strange things to people, especially when you're crowned at 13, worshipped by courtiers, and never once told no in your entire life. The result is a long, glittering parade of monarchs who ruled nations the way most people manage group chats, impulsively, vindictively, and without an ounce of self-awareness. So, let's drift through history's most spectacular examples of royal dysfunction. Softly, slowly, and with the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'll never have to host these people for dinner. We'll begin with Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, radiant, magnificent, and utterly exhausting. Louis believed he was the living embodiment of France, not metaphorically, but literally. When he said, "L'État, c'est moi," he meant it. He was the state. The rest of France was, presumably, background decoration. He built Versailles, that golden labyrinth of mirrors, fountains, and etiquette rules so complicated that even seasoned courtiers occasionally forgot how to stand correctly. Louis didn't just want obedience. He wanted choreography. He scheduled his waking and sleeping hours as public ceremonies. Courtiers competed for the honor of handing him his shirt or holding the royal chamber pot. The entire French nobility functioned like a live-in audience for his daily performance of divinely ordained vanity. And yet, beneath all the glitter, Louis was surprisingly insecure. He micromanaged his ministers, spied on his nobles, and waged unnecessary wars mostly to prove he could. He left France dazzling, yes, but also bankrupt, starved, and simmering with resentment. It turns out being the sun isn't easy when your subjects keep getting heat stroke from one Louis to another. Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, inherited not only the throne, but also a deeply dysfunctional sense of entitlement. He began as Louis the Well-Beloved, a title that didn't age well. By the time he died, people were literally celebrating in the streets. Louis XV had a simple philosophy. If something was difficult, he'd rather not. He avoided work, avoided wars he couldn't win, and avoided aging by surrounding himself with increasingly younger mistresses. His court became a soap opera of jealous nobles and ambitious courtesans, none more famous than Madame de Pompadour, his chief mistress, political advisor, and occasional decorator. She organized the king's entertainment schedule, influenced diplomacy, and designed entire palace wings just to flatter her aesthetic. When she died, Louis replaced her with a rotating cast of teenage girls supplied by courtiers hoping for royal favor. The public was scandalized, not just morally, but economically. The king's indulgence became the symbol of everything wrong with France. By the time he died in 1774, France was teetering toward revolution. His successor, Louis XVI, inherited both the throne and the collective national side that came with it. Let's drift north again, to England, land of stiff upper lips and flexible royal morals. Few monarchs embodied dysfunction quite like George IV. He was, in every sense, too much, too fat, too vain, too dramatic, too fond of champagne breakfasts. As Prince Regent, he spent more money on tailoring than some countries spent on infrastructure. He collected mistresses, waistcoats, and debts in equal measure. His coronation alone cost more than the annual defense budget. George's relationship with his father, George III, was a masterpiece of mutual loathing. While the elder George struggled with bouts of mental illness, the younger one publicly mocked him and tried to seize power early. When George IV finally became king, he ruled mostly from his bedroom, surrounded by velvet cushions and regret. He banned his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, from his coronation, an act of pettiness so spectacular that Londoners booed him in the streets. The irony, of course, was that Caroline wasn't much better. Their marriage had been a disaster from hour one. Literally, when they first met, he was drunk, she was confused, and he reportedly asked for brandy before the introductions were finished. They separated almost immediately, then spent the next 2 decades trading scandals like playing cards. If you ever feel your relationship communication could improve, remember that George and Caroline's was conducted through newspapers. Across the Baltic, dysfunction took on an even chillier tone. Enter Peter III of Russia, husband to Catherine the Great. Peter was technically emperor, but his hobbies suggested he'd have been happier as a reclusive child. He loved toy soldiers, worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia, and staged fake military drills in his bedroom while ignoring actual government business. His wife, Catherine, found this frustrating, also humiliating. Within 6 months of becoming emperor, Peter had alienated the army, the church, and his wife, an impressive trifecta of political self-destruction. Catherine eventually staged a coup, taking the throne for herself. Peter was quietly imprisoned and died soon after, probably murdered by people who were simply tired of his nonsense. Catherine went on to rule for decades with intelligence, cunning, and an alarming collection of lovers. Peter, meanwhile, became a historical footnote, a warning about what happens when you mistake toy soldiers for a career path. Of course, Catherine herself wasn't immune to royal dysfunction, just more efficient at it. Her reign was brilliant, but her personal life read like a novel ghostwritten by gossip. She cycled through lovers like most people go through slippers, occasionally promoting them to government posts. One of her favorites, Grigory Potemkin, may have been her secret husband. He was loyal, charming, and occasionally delusional, most famously for building fake villages along the Dnieper River to impress her during an inspection tour. Whether those villages actually existed is debatable, but the phrase Potemkin village has endured, meaning something that looks perfect until you touch it, a fitting metaphor, really, for much of royal history. Now let's glide west again, to Spain, where dysfunction wasn't just a phase, it was practically tradition. After poor Charles II and his genetic finale, the Spanish Bourbons tried to restore normalcy. They succeeded only intermittently. Ferdinand VII ruled in the early 19th century, a man so untrustworthy that his allies and enemies took turns hating him. He betrayed liberal reformers, then betrayed conservatives, then betrayed his own promises. He also married 4 times, mostly to his nieces. Naturally, his last wife, Maria Cristina, outlived him and spent years trying to secure the throne for their infant daughter. This triggered a civil war. Spain's history, for much of the 19th century, can be summarized as: a king dies, everyone panics, and someone declares war about it. Speaking of panic, we should visit Frederick William I of Prussia, also known as the Soldier King. Frederick William ran his court like a boot camp. He hated luxury, adored discipline, and considered laughter a sign of weakness. His greatest obsession was his regiment of giant soldiers, exceptionally tall men he collected from across Europe, sometimes by kidnapping them. He loved watching them march. He didn't use them in battle, of course. That would have been too risky. He just liked to look at them. His son, the future Frederick the Great, was less enthusiastic about this military hobby. He preferred philosophy, music, and not being screamed at by his father. When Frederick was a teenager, he tried to run away from home with his best friend. His father caught them, executed the friend in front of him, and forced Frederick to watch. It's hard to imagine a better recipe for emotional distance. Frederick eventually inherited the throne and became one of Europe's greatest rulers, efficient, cultured, and cold as ice. Dysfunction, when refined, can look remarkably like genius. Let's drift over to Denmark, a small kingdom with an outsized record of royal oddities. In the 18th century, King Christian VII reigned while barely functioning. He suffered from severe mental illness, often talking to himself, compulsively washing his hands, and running through palace corridors without pants. His court didn't know what to do. Struensee introduced sweeping Enlightenment reforms, abolishing torture, improving education, and reducing censorship. Unfortunately, he also failed to notice that sleeping with the queen tends to complicate your job security. He was arrested, executed, and dismembered. The queen was exiled, and poor Christian was left alone, muttering to himself about imaginary soldiers. It's one of those stories that begins like a romantic drama and ends like a tragic opera written by bureaucracy. And finally, let's pause on one of history's most tragic and unintentionally comedic figures, Emperor Nero of Rome. Nero inherited an empire at 16 and promptly decided to treat it as his personal theater. He fancied himself a musician, poet, and charioteer, though contemporary accounts suggest he was bad at all 3. He performed in public, forcing senators to applaud for hours. Anyone caught leaving the performance early risked execution. Or worse, an encore. When Rome burned in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had played his lyre while the city burned. It's unlikely to be true, but it fit the vibe. He then blamed the Christians, executed them theatrically, and continued composing mediocre poetry. Eventually, even his guards grew tired of him. He fled the city, muttering, "What an artist dies in me," before taking his own life. Rome, meanwhile, sighed in collective relief and got back to rebuilding. The thread running through all these rulers, from Versailles to St. Petersburg, from London to Rome, isn't just pettiness, it's isolation. When you're raised to believe you're divine, even the smallest slight becomes cosmic. A courtier's eye roll feels like heresy. A spouse's complaint becomes treason. And so they overreacted, endlessly, pettily, historically. We remember them not for wisdom, but for tantrums that spanned empires. So, as we let the palace lights dim one last time tonight, imagine them, the world's most powerful people, pacing gilded halls in silk slippers, furious that someone forgot to bow at the right angle. All that power, all that wealth, and not a hint of self-control. Perhaps history's greatest comfort is knowing that, for all their crowns and titles, they were mostly just human, terribly, wonderfully human. The kind of people who'd start a war over a seating chart. In our next and final descent, we'll close this series with something softer, sickly, spoiled, and sad. The fragile childhoods of medieval royals, a lullaby of loneliness, tutors, and questionable medical advice. But for now, rest easy. You survived the tantrums of kings. The night is quiet again, and no one's about to declare war over who gets the bigger pillow. Sickly, spoiled, and sad. The fragile childhoods of medieval royals. Hey everyone, welcome back. You can lie down for this one. It's going to be slow, gentle, and ever so slightly tragic. Tonight, we're drifting back to the nursery wing of history. Those drafty stone rooms where the heirs of kingdoms were raised on velvet cushions, goat's milk, and unreasonable expectations. Because while royal childhoods might sound idyllic, filled with toys and tutors, they were often lonely, over-medicated, and occasionally fatal. Let's wander quietly through those echoing corridors, where tiny princes sneezed into silk handkerchiefs and anxious nurses whispered prayers to prevent dynastic collapse by pneumonia. Medieval medicine had a complicated relationship with childhood. Most doctors believed babies were miniature adults, just smaller, moister, and more troublesome. Royal physicians diagnosed everything from excessive vapors to unbalanced humors, which roughly translates to, "We have no idea what's happening." Treatments ranged from bleeding to purging to wrapping the child in herbs and hoping for divine intervention. It didn't help that royalty was obsessed with producing heirs, but had no idea how to keep them alive. Infant mortality among the nobility could rival that of peasants, only with better funeral outfits. Take Edward VI of England, Henry VIII's long-awaited son. He was treated like a living relic, the miracle boy who would secure the Tudor line. Unfortunately, his health was delicate from the start. Chronic fevers, persistent coughs, and an entire cabinet's worth of medical experiments marked his short life. His tutors adored his intellect, but noted that he waxed pale with every exertion. He wasn't allowed to run, laugh too hard, or breathe near courtiers who looked contagious, which in Tudor England was basically everyone. He became king at 9 and died before 16. His reign dominated by regents and doctors debating whether his lungs or his politics would fail first. Across the Channel, France was no better. The Valois princes of the 14th and 15th centuries were notorious for their fragility. Royal nurseries were laboratories of superstition. Nurses tested milk on their own lips before feeding the infant, lest poison strike. Every toy had to be blessed by a priest, and the walls were hung with relics, bits of saints meant to ward off everything from fever to bad dreams. One chronicler describes a prince who wept day and night, being vexed by demons of the stomach. Modern translation: probably gas. Treatment: prayer, lavender oil, and gentle exorcism. If the boys were pampered, the girls were negotiated. Princesses were raised less like children and more like future trade agreements. From the moment they could stand, they were trained to curtsy, embroider, and speak 3 languages, not for fun, but so they could someday flatter a husband chosen for them by their father's treaty obligations. Consider Margaret of Scotland, sent to marry the Dauphin of France at the age of 11. She arrived in Paris in a dress so heavy with jewels she could barely move. Her new husband ignored her entirely. The court mocked her accent. She died at 21 of consumption, which was the period's polite word for stress and tuberculosis. Royal childhoods tended to end abruptly, one way or another. The one exception might be Henry, the Navigator of Portugal. He survived infancy, mostly because he was too stubborn to die. His tutors raised him in a castle so remote it might as well have been another planet. He spent hours alone, sketching maps of imaginary worlds and watching the sea. He'd eventually fund voyages that opened new trade routes and new moral disasters. But as a child, he was simply lonely. Royal solitude was a recurring theme. Every friend, every servant, every animal existed under the shadow of protocol. Even playtime required supervision and a small audience. It's hard to imagine a worse environment for mental stability, though, to be fair, it did produce some interesting cartographers. Of course, not every royal child was delicate. Some were just dangerously indulged. Richard II of England, for example, grew up believing he was chosen by God and, more importantly, better dressed than everyone else. He loved fine fabrics and elaborate banquets, which would have been harmless if he hadn't also enjoyed bankrupting the treasury to pay for them. He commissioned portraits of himself surrounded by angels, refused to listen to advisors, and once had an entire parliament arrested for disagreeing with him. It's what happens when you give a spoiled teenager divine right and too many velvet doublets. Sometimes, though, the sickness was real, not just metaphorical. Charles VI of France began his reign with promise. Handsome, energetic, fond of dancing. Then one summer, riding with his army, he suddenly snapped. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, screaming that they were traitors. From that day on, his mind unraveled. He suffered violent episodes, believed he was made of glass, and refused to be touched for fear of shattering. Court physicians prescribed pilgrimages, herbal baths, and long sessions of hopeful staring. Meanwhile, his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, managed his affairs, and not discreetly. Rumors spread of affairs, illegitimate children, and a kingdom ruled by proxy while the king sat trembling behind locked doors. It's one of medieval Europe's saddest stories. A monarch reduced to a fragile metaphor for his own empire, glittering, fractured, and always on the edge of breaking. Illness in royal childhoods wasn't always physical or mental. Sometimes it was political. Ivan the Terrible of Russia grew up in a palace where murder was a morning hobby. His parents died when he was small. His guardians poisoned each other in succession. Servants beat him for sport. He spent much of his youth hiding in corners, feeding scraps to stray dogs, which he liked more than people. When he finally became Tsar, he compensated for a lifetime of fear by inventing new forms of cruelty. It's hard to say he wasn't shaped by his childhood. It's just unfortunate for everyone else that he was. Then there's Mary Tudor, later known as Bloody Mary. Her childhood was one long exercise in betrayal. Her father, Henry VIII, doted on her until he decided to divorce her mother. Then he declared Mary illegitimate, forbade her from seeing her mother again, and demoted her from princess to lady. She spent her teenage years sick, isolated, and terrified of being executed for existing. By adulthood, she was a nervous wreck with severe depression and religious obsession. When she finally became queen, she took comfort in enforcing her faith, the only way she'd been taught discipline worked. By fire, childhood trauma, it seems, scales up alarmingly when your childhood involved a palace. Meanwhile, the young Louis XIII of France lived in constant fear of his mother, Marie de Medici, who ruled as regent after his father's assassination. She filled the palace with Italian favorites, alienated the nobility, and treated her son as an inconvenient decorative object. At 13, Louis staged a quiet coup to exile her, the world's politic-matricidal rebellion. He then grew into a reclusive, awkward adult who trusted no one and expressed affection mostly through hunting. He's remembered less for personal triumphs and more for having Cardinal Richelieu do everything for him. An entire generation of French power politics was basically one long episode of parental therapy. It's tempting to imagine that royal children were spoiled beyond suffering, but the truth is stranger. They were both overindulged and overcontrolled. Everyone around them wanted something: power, favor, survival. Love rarely made the list. They slept under gold-embroidered canopies, but never alone. They were fed delicacies, but monitored for every bite. Even toys were inspected for heresy or political symbolism. The result? Adults who either collapsed under expectation or lashed out against it. Sometimes both. One of the gentler casualties of this system was Prince Arthur of Brittany, nephew of King John of England. At 16, he was captured during a power struggle and imprisoned in a tower. He disappeared soon after. Contemporary whispers said John killed him personally. Whether or not that's true, the story became legend. A reminder that in royal families, childhood wasn't protection. It was potential threat. Even innocent heirs made dangerous hostages. Royal doctors did their best, of course. They just didn't know what they were doing. A typical prescription for a feverish child might include crushed emeralds, pigeon broth, and a brief exorcism. When that failed, they turned to astrology. Perhaps the stars were unhappy, so they waited for Mercury to move into a friendlier sign. Meanwhile, the child continued coughing. Royal medicine often cured only the physician's reputation. Some royal children were aware of their absurdity. Elizabeth I, for instance, grew up watching everyone around her executed for being on the wrong side of family politics. She learned to smile, flatter, and keep her thoughts locked behind a polite mask. When she finally became queen, she turned that mask into armor. She never married, never had children, and never apologized for either. In a world that devoured its heirs, she simply refused to make more of them. If you listen closely to these stories, there's a pattern, a sort of melancholy rhythm running beneath all the splendor. Behind every jeweled cradle was fear. Behind every velvet curtain, intrigue. And behind every smiling portrait of a cherubic royal child, the quiet knowledge that survival itself was a political achievement. For most medieval dynasties, the hardest thing wasn't conquering kingdoms. It was keeping their children alive long enough to inherit them. So, as we let this story drift into the stillness of the night, picture the royal nursery again. A pale child sleeping beneath embroidered saints, a nurse pacing slowly, candle flickering against tapestries. Somewhere, a court physician writes in his journal that the prince's humors appear less troubled tonight. Outside, the wind moves through the courtyard. The torches burn low. The empire dreams of its fragile future. And in the quiet, you can almost hear the collective sigh of history's smallest monarchs. Tired, pampered, frightened, and already halfway to legend. You've made it through our fifth and final descent. From royal glory to the cradle, from the crown to the crib. If you're still awake, you're doing better than most medieval heirs. But maybe now, it's time to rest. No politics, no physicians, no dynasties, just sleep. Because tonight, the throne is empty, the candles are out, and the kingdom, for once, can dream peacefully. Good night.